Okay, my darlings, welcome to my YouTube channel and my super exciting lectures on mostly modern world history. So today we're going to talk about World War I. Now, for the past week or so, we've been talking a lot about the causes of World War I, and if you remember them, we have our four long-term causes of militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And they all come to a head on June 28th, 1914, when Gavrilo Princip of the Black Hand assassinates Franz Ferdinand, and a month later, Serbia has rejected Austria-Hungary's demands, and thus on July 28th, 1914, Austria-Hungary is going to declare war on Serbia, which then sets off a chain of events that ultimately involves the entire world and leads to tens of millions of lives lost in a 4-year plus period. It's important to note that one of the reasons why so many of these countries got involved was because they expected this war to be very quick. The running idea was that the war would be over before Christmas. So really they thought this would be a couple months and everyone would be in. But as these images hopefully illustrate, this war is very different from anything that comes before it because of the technology, because the fact that the world had changed so much since the last time there had been a large global conflict in Western civilization. That's going to be the Napoleonic Wars. And because there's so much unexpected change, this is one of the reasons why this war becomes so intense, so long, and still whose repercussions are being felt to this day. So let's begin, shall we? Okay, some basics. So last week when we talked about alliances as one of our main causes of World War I, we talked about the Triple Entente, which is going to be England, France, and Russia. Remember, Entente is a French word for alliance, as well as the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. As the war progresses, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance are going to turn into the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. And the Allied Powers is a phrase that we'll hear again when World War II begins. So who are these countries that we're talking about? Central Powers, these are going to be our countries primarily in red on the map. So that's going to be Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, which is modern-day Turkey, and Bulgaria. Those are the four main countries of the Central Powers, and they're named because they are in the center of the war. Our Allied Powers, this is going to be our former Triple Entente, England, France, and Russia, as well as smaller minor countries. So the rest of Europe that's in green, that's going to be your Serbia, which is down in the Balkans, right around here, right here. So sandwiched between Austria-Hungary and Ottoman Empire. Bulgaria and Ottoman Empire. So Serbia, and then we have Greece, Romania, Portugal, and what's this last one? Montenegro, which is a super tiny country right here that really, this is one of the few times that we will talk about them. So we have our Central Powers in the center of Europe, and then our Allied Powers that are on either side. This is going to be a big problem, as we'll see on the next slide. So one of the other geographic terms to really know about and to be aware of when we talk about World War I, that one of the terms that's frankly synonymous with World War I is the concept of the Western Front. Western Front is going to be the border between France and Germany. Why is it the Western Front? Because it's west of Germany. Now, Germany did not want there to be a Western Front, which would also imply that there's an Eastern Front. They didn't want there to be wars on either side of them. So they had this plan named by Paul von Schlieffen, who was a German military strategist. So he had this idea. He said, all right, here's what we're going to do. First, Germany is going to run over to France and defeat them. And then once France is defeated, then we'll move back and go east and then fight Russia. Because, as we know, the war begins, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, and then Russia moves their troops to the west, and then Germany gets involved, and they start declaring war on France, and then England declares war on them. So Germany knows that it has against them both France and Russia, and they know that fighting a two-front war is not going to be successful. They cannot win if they're fighting both on the west and the east. And spoiler alert, that's what happens and they end up losing. But we'll get there, don't worry. So what's their goal? They want to avoid this, what's called a two-front war. They want to fight just one war at a time. Now, why were they so confident in their ability that they said, oh, we'll just quickly defeat France and then we'll go defeat Russia? Why are they so confident? Because, if you remember, and I've talked about this a couple of times, in 1870, there was that Franco-Prussian War. And this is the war that, because they're so successful, Germany actually unifies. Prussia is a region of Germany that kind of was like the biggest kind of state of what's now Germany. And because they fight this war against France, who's been a country for millennia, and because not only do they defeat France, they kick France's butt so much that they are so successful, and this is why France and England then become allies, because they're so scared of Germany. Germany thinks this is going to be super easy. We've beaten France in the past, we'll be able to beat them in 1914. Again, this war will be over by Christmas. Not a big deal. Other thing to note about that is that in order to get from Germany over to France, now they could go direct along their southern border, but there's a whole bunch of mountains here. So instead what they do is they swing north and they swing through tiny little Brussels, small little country. I'm sorry, not Brussels. Brussels is the capital of Belgium. Tiny little country, famous pretty much for watches and chocolate, as well as horrible colonialism and the decimation of the Congolese peoples, but story for another day. And when they march through Belgium, they destroy a lot of towns. They burn villages, they steal from the Belgian people, they attack and harm many of the women. It's really, really bad. Now, Belgium is a tiny little country, but they have one big ally, and that's Great Britain. So this is actually how Great Britain gets involved in the war, because as Germany marches through, and it only takes a couple of days for them to march through and march into Belgium and destroy so much of Belgium, in response to that, the United Kingdom is going to declare war on Germany. And because of the Triple Entente, they're obviously going to be declaring war on the side of what will become the Allied powers of France and Russia. This is going to change everything. Dun, dun, dun. That leads us to the First Battle of the Marne. Now, the war begins in the end of July. It takes a while for the first major battle to occur, and that's going to be in September of 1914. And what happens is, this is the first battle. The French think, all right, the Germans think, all right, we're going to come in, we're going to defeat the French, then we'll get out of France and head over to Russia. That's our plan. But what they don't expect and don't count on is the fact that England is getting involved now as well. So by the time September rolls around, England has declared war on Germany. France is at war with Germany. They joined forces at the Battle of the Marne, which is in northeastern France. It's in the Marne Valley. It's a big, widespread space. And what happens is the Germans do not successfully defeat the French, but instead they actually have to retreat, and they lose ground. So the Schlieffen plan is going to fail in an utter disaster. So sad for Paul von Schlieffen. The other thing that this leads to, and the other important takeaway from the First Battle of the Marne, is that it's going to lead to a stalemate, in that the Germans, they retreat to their lines, and the French and the British, they stay at their lines, and neither side is able to gain enough of an advantage to declare a winner of this of this battle. So it leads to this massive stalemate, as well as massive death, as we'll see. Let's talk a little bit more about the stalemate. Couple of results of the stalemate coming from the Battle of the Marne, which is actually will be known as the First Battle of the Marne, because spoiler alert, we'll talk about a second one much later. So what are some of the results? Germany is forced now to fight a two-front war because they're stuck in France. They thought they were going to get in, defeat France, and then leave, but now they have to stay there to defend what meager land that they have acquired. But Russia has declared war on them, and they know they also have to fight the Russians. So now they have to fight a two-front war. This stalemate will last for the duration of the war. And if you remember from the first slide, that this war lasts for more than 4 years. And the Western Front, which is this region between Germany, the west of Germany, and northeastern France, This stalemate and this Western Front will last for the entirety of the war. Neither side will ever really gain enough land. They might gain some yardage, they might gain some miles, but really the stalemate and the Western Front, the lines that are drawn in 1914, remain until the end of the war in 1918. Some other important battles that occur along the stalemate, which each side attempts to gain ground, but ultimately they do not, will be the Battle of Verdun, which takes place near the Battle of the Marne, the Battle of the Somme, which is a river, and also in the same region. And in both of these battles, we're going to see the loss of life climb into the hundreds of thousands. This is unlike anything that has ever occurred in Western human history before. Most battles, they have battles, and in some of the more extreme ones, you have thousands of men that die, maybe tens of thousands, but never have you really seen hundreds of thousands of men die at one battle at one time. This is unlike anything that has occurred. Now, you might be wondering yourself, Ms. Dubb, why are you not talking more about strategy and artillery and things of that nature? Because I'm not going to lie, I'm not a military historian. I don't really go into the particulars. So if you're excited about that, I apologize. But that's just not where my focus is. For our intents and purposes, we really need to understand this concept of the stalemate as well as the impact on human life. And again, how this war is so different from all conflicts that have occurred prior to it. Some of the other factors that really make this war so different are these new styles of fighting that we're going to see. Number one, there's tons of new technology that have been developed in the latter 19th, early 20th century that are used for the first time on a mass scale in World War I. And this is also one of the factors that why this war leads to so much death and devastation, because nobody expects these technologies. Nobody has ever experienced them, so they don't realize just how devastating and how massive they can be. So what are some of these new technologies? Machine guns. So if you remember from imperialism, the Maxim gun, which is one of the factors that allows European powers to penetrate into Central Africa beyond the coast. So machine guns in which you're able to fire rounds within several rounds per second, per minute, etc. Oh, cool, I'm getting an email. Airplanes, developed by the Wright brothers and others, used for the first time in military conflict in World War I. So now you have fighting that's up in the skies. You have planes that can drop bombs and can shoot from the sky. It's super dangerous. Tanks are used for the first time, and they're going to be able to lead to major devastation. And then finally, one of the most devastating and horrific aspects of this war is the use of poison gas. You are going to see examples of both sides are going to use things like mustard gas, chloroform gas. So many of these technologies, so many of these new styles of, these new forms of poison are used. So what they will do is they're along each side of the Western Front, and instead of lobbing over a cannon or some sort of bomb, they send one over in which there's poison inside of it, and it lands and can immediately kill all the people around or lead to devastation. You see in response, people develop things of gas masks because horses are still used in this conflict, and this is the last Western conflict in which the cavalry is used. They do develop gas masks for horses, although it is not as effective as one would hope. So lots of new styles of technology that are going to lead to so much death and devastation. Another aspect of World War I that is super unique and leads to all these different results and long-lasting is trench warfare. And as I said, the Western Front is a term that's synonymous with World War I. Trench warfare is another one of them. It's another term. And trench warfare is literally in which soldiers are digging trenches. They're digging ditches in the ground and they fight each other from them. So if you remember, we talked about the stalemate, that both sides kind of hunker down along their line. They have the space in between their lines. This is called no man's land. It's flat land. There's very little foliage. So it's very dangerous to be above ground. So instead, what the armies will do is they will dig trenches. And you can see here some examples of them. People are just standing around, hanging out in their trenches. They're usually about man height or so. And that's where they have kind of a strategic advantage, a defensive advantage. So, what does this trench warfare lead to? It leads to very little movement because you are dug into the ground. You're literally digging into your line. Um, and it does not allow for much movement because it's very dangerous to go out of the trenches. What's called going over the top when you go over and out of the trench into no man's land in between the two lines. In addition, because you're hanging out in the trenches and basically the way fighting is happening, this is not like battles in which armies run at each other and then they have lots of fighting and then they retreat. Instead, these armies are stuck in their positions. And how are they engaging with each other? They're launching rockets, they're launching cannons, they're launching bombs, they're launching lobs of poison gas. So it is a lot of men standing around, spending long periods of time waiting for a launch to occur, waiting for something to happen, which leads to a lot of boredom. It's also going to lead to a lot of disease. Because remember, this war lasts for 4 years during all the seasons. In springtime, in summer, in the heat, in fall, and even in the winter, in the bitter cold. These men are in trenches, and when it rains, when it snows, when there's bad weather, there is nowhere for them to go. They are out in the elements, which means that they have lots of disease and lots of repercussions. We will go into that and look into that more in depthly. Fear not. So what are the results of these new styles of fighting with these new technologies and this new method called trench warfare? This war is so much more brutal and the amount of death is so much greater than anything the Western world, than anything the world has ever seen. It is completely unexpected for this war to become so brutal. Both sides, the Central Powers, as well as the Allied powers, they both think they have strong technology. And where's this technology coming from? The Industrial Revolution, right? So they both think that they have this superior technology. They both think that they will be able to use it quickly and that this war will be over within months. But because of the stalemate, because of the trench warfare, and because of the brutality of these technologies, this war does not last for 4 months. Instead, it lasts for more than 4 years. Briefly, let's talk about the Eastern Front. So the Eastern Front is going to be along the German-Russian border. So again, east of Germany and west of Russia. Primarily the fighting that takes place there are going to be the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, as well as the Russians and Serbians. So the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians from the Central Powers, and the Russians and the Serbians from the Allied powers. England and France, they are pretty much 100% in the Western Front. The Ottoman Empire, they're going to be involved a bit along the Eastern Front, along the Southeastern Front, where we see the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as some areas around the Black Sea, etc. This front is much more mobile because we don't see the use of trench warfare nearly as extensively utilized. So there's much more movement, fewer stalemates, more land gained and lost. So we see a lot more tanks, we see a lot more armies that are actually moving east, that are moving west, that are covering ground. Some of the big battles, and again, not going into great detail, but some of the big battles that take place are the Battle of Tannenberg, which happens one of the first main battles of the war in August 1914, and the Battle of Gallipoli, which is now along modern-day Turkey, which lasts from February to December of 1915. The Battle of Gallipoli is one example where we do see a stalemate occur. It's primarily, and this is where actually the British and the Ottoman Empire take place in this. Gallipoli is in modern-day Turkey. And it's a really terrible war. And in fact, if you are ever in a Commonwealth nation, so that's Australia, Canada, New Zealand, so the Commonwealth of the United Kingdom. This is where primarily those forces fought, and they actually have a Commonwealth Day, or I'm sorry, not Commonwealth Day, an Anzac Day, so Australia, New Zealand, NZ, and then Canada, in which they commemorate the mass loss of life because you have hundreds of thousands of Commonwealth members. So Australia, Canada, New Zealand, these are countries that have nothing to do with the war, but because they are at that time colonies of Great Britain, you have hundreds of thousands of forces being sent to fight in this very brutal battle. All right, two final ideas to culminate our notes with. So our first concept is the concept of total war, and that's countries are devoting all of their resources to this war effort. So the government, all of the decisions that they're making largely have to do with the war effort, or the war is influencing all of their decisions. The economy is focused primarily on supporting the war efforts. Food is all going to the war, so we see many people, this is where rationing becomes a big part of people's lives. So people say, I'm not going to eat as much food. Instead, I want to make sure that the men at the front lines, as well as women, because there are women that are nurses that are supporting the troops, that the men and women, that they get enough food because they are obviously fighting for the national cause, as well as all production. So no longer, we see a lot of factories at this time that had been producing goods for personal, individual consumption, turn their focus into producing machines and items used for the war. So companies that had been producing, I don't know, whatever factory production was happening in the early 20th century, instead now producing guns and producing ammunition and producing tanks and producing all the things that are needed at the war. So everybody's focus is on the war. People are either volunteering and joining the forces. You see the majority of men that are very young, from about 18 to 30 or so. Most of those men are joining up and enlisting to serve, or they're being conscripted to serve. And if you are not serving in the war, you are supporting it. You're supporting it by rationing your food. You're supporting it by going to companies and producing things for the war effort. Your entire focus is this war, and everybody is affected by the war. You don't really have people that say, oh, I don't know anyone who's serving, because everybody knows someone. And also another factor that we'll look into is the concept of propaganda, which is when we see one-sided information that's designed to influence people. So we see a lot of new artistic technology with propaganda posters all over the place, lots of ways to get people to be involved. So this is a great example. This little girl is sitting on her father's lap asking what he did in the Great War, and he's looking pensive. You don't want to be that man. You don't want to be known as the man who did nothing for the war effort. So lots of guilt tripping is used at this time as well. So this concept of total war, that everything in total is going to the war. And our final concept of the day is the concept of global war. This is called a world war for a reason, and that's because fighting is actually extended into Asia as well as Africa. Now, why are they extended to Asia and Africa? What do these Asian African regions have to do with a conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary in Central Europe? Well, because what's happening in Asia and Africa at this time? They're colonies of these European powers. So as I mentioned with the Battle of Gallipoli, with the Canadian as well, so our Canadian and then our Kiwi forces, our New Zealand forces and Australian forces, they're being sent to this battle right here in Gallipoli in the Ottoman Empire, as well as troops from Africa, troops from Asia. They are all being sent to this conflict. And we actually do see fighting that happens. There's fighting that occurs in northern and central and southern Africa between German colonies and British colonies that are happening there. We do see some fighting happening in Asia, but the biggest impact is that we really see a lot of forces come from the colonies and be sent to these areas to fight. South America, Central America, they get involved as well, even though Spain is neutral. We still see many of these countries either sending goods, sending support, and in some respects sending troops as well. So this truly is a global war, a world war. So in conclusion, what are our big takeaways? This is a war that's completely unexpected. People feel that the war will be over in months, and yet instead the result is years of fighting, years of incredibly brutal and horrific fighting due to the new technologies, due to the new styles of fighting, due to the fact that everybody is affected by this war all around the globe. This is truly a war that sets up the 20th century, and the repercussions of this war are still felt to this day because decisions that are made during this time are still, we're still feeling the impacts of them even now, more than 100 years later. So congratulations, you survived your first lecture via the internets, and let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you all on Friday. Have a good rest of your day. Be good to the sub.